It's my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Chris Golde. Chris Golde earned her Ph.D. in education at Stanford, and then she went on to University of Wisconsin for a number of years, and then took on the task of research director at the Carnegie Initiative on the Doctorate, which I think was a fascinating study on doctoral education in the United States. And that produced a couple of volumes, at least a couple that I'm familiar with, one on rethinking doctoral education for the 21st century, and another on envisioning the future of doctoral education. And I think these are really sort of must-read books for people who are interested in thinking about challenges and future directions in graduate education. She then returned to Stanford, where she is currently Associate Vice Provost for Graduate Education, and I think she has a lot of experience and in graduate education to share with us, and I'm very much looking forward for her discussion of 5 pressing challenges for doctoral education. I'm sure there are many more, but I'm glad you were able to identify 5.
Brenda, thank you very, very much. It's a complete pleasure to be here. I've really been looking forward to this. And I just wanted to start by commending all of you for taking the time to come and spend the day working on these really important and thinking about these important and what I think of as important and completely pressing issues, which is the health of doctoral education in America. And I want to acknowledge that I think time is our most precious resource, and you are giving that today. So thank you. Thank you for that. In the last half century, American doctoral education has really been considered the best in the world. And we have maybe gotten to the point where we're a little bit complacent about that. Many things are changing, as you surely know. Changing knowledge structures, changing career paths, changing demographics, changing funding structures, increased world competition. And all of those are really raising the stakes. So if we want to maintain our excellence, we need to be purposeful, and we need to think carefully and imaginatively about what needs to stay the same and what needs to change. So congratulations for thinking about this, and I hope that I can provide some fodder for your thinking and help us move forward. So because I was trained as a higher education researcher, I always want to start with the big picture, with the context. Past is prologue, as the provost said, and I always have to put in at least one graph in my talk, so this is my graph. This is the number of doctorates granted annually in the United States since we've been keeping federal records on the matter. So this is 100 years worth of data, and as you can see, obviously, the slope is upward. So we are now granting, as I think someone already said this morning, about 50,000 doctorates a year in this country from small beginnings since the century of a little over a century ago, where we started roughly here. So in addition, the number of doctoral granting institutions has risen as well from, again, a handful to now over 400. There's been a commensurate growth in the number of fields offering the doctorate. There's not just been a growth in the number of students, but great diversification in the student population by socioeconomic status, gender, ethnicity, national origin, among others. It's also the case that the research enterprise and the educational enterprise have become really completely interwoven. They've been knitted together by federal, state, and institutional funds, and it makes it really difficult, I think, sometimes to kind of look at this complex ecosystem. And I just guess I would observe that knowledge creation goals and educational mission goals sometimes are at cross-purpose, sometimes they work together, but it's really hard to disentangle them. But I want to point us to thinking hard about the educational mission of doctoral education, which I've started thinking about as doctoral student development. And I wanted to offer you this schematic as a way to think about that. This schematic describes students' development into what I started to call emerging academic professionals, not a very felicitous phrase, but that's the person who's a young scientist, a new historian, so someone who's a junior member of the guild but has really started to learn and adopt the knowledge, skills, and habits of mind of a full member, so that someone would say, oh yes, that person is a scientist. This schematic implies that there's some predictable ways in which students grow and change, and I like the word development because it suggests an ongoing process. Now, obviously, we all start our development before we come to graduate school, and we continue our development hopefully through our entire lives and careers, but here I'm really just trying to focus on students' development during the graduate education period. I also like this schematic because it turns our attention to who and by whom and how this development is promoted or impeded. There's 2 dimensions on here, so I don't have a pointer, but you can see it's kind of arrayed by stages. So this temporal dimension describes development over time in roughly 3 stages. So I think of this entry and integration stage as capturing roughly the first year of a doctoral program. Stage 2, this developing competence, is roughly the middle years. And then the final 1 to 2 years is the stage of exit and completion. It took a while for us to kind of come to these 3 arenas of development, but I think of these as the domains that are like the primary emphasis of doctoral education. Now, most universities provide resources to help students with their psychosocial development and their personal and emotional lives, but we also think of doctoral students as being relatively mature adults who've figured out some of the personal resources to handle their own personal lives. And so this narrower focus on these 3 domains, I think, helps distinguish doctoral education from undergraduate studies as well. So briefly, these 3 domains. The development as a researcher and scholar, I think that's really what we think of. Oh, thank you. As the primary goals. Let's see, I got this pointer, so let's see if I can use it. No. All right, well, you can see that. The development as a researcher and scholar, that we think of that as the primary role of doctoral education. I think President Bach made a very persuasive case that a second domain is the development as a teacher, and I think of teaching broadly defined. So not just undergraduate classroom teaching, but any ways that you're teaching to any audience. So that's how you explain and talk about and persuade about your work, which you will do in any career path that a student would take. And finally, the development of a professional identity, so acquiring the habits of mind and adopting the values of a member of the disciplinary community. So then we can see as students develop along these trajectories, this gets a little busy, but trying to say students in researching in the domains of research and teaching develop from novice to emerging expert, develop from a stance of dependence to real independence, and in this domain of professional identity, from little sense of a professional identity to really possessing and adopting and understanding the professional norms and values. I think this scheme is kind of helpful because it helps us to ask, it raises a whole lot of questions. What do we expect of students at each domain at each stage? What are potential problems? And we can almost use this in an assessment way, to use the A word. How are we doing and how are our students doing, if we have a notion of how they should be developing? All right, so I just kind of, for me, this is a situation, I wanted to situate both with the complexity of the enterprise and kind of our goals, and then I want to turn to the 5 challenges promised in the title of my talk. And I think implicit in the idea of this event is the premise that as good as our doctoral programs are, and clearly they are excellent here at Johns Hopkins, they could become better. I think President Bach made that case again persuasively. And so I want to talk about the 5 challenges that I've selected are really the puzzles around improvement that are really campus-based. So the things that are within our control, so I am not talking about things like the uncertainties of federal research funding, troubling though those are, important though those are, impactful on doctoral education as those are. I think those are relatively outside of most of our control, so I wanted to talk about the things where you have some role that you can play. When Brenda and I were first talking, she urged me to discuss interdisciplinarity. Now, this was not a surprise. Every discipline is really expanding its boundaries these days, and nearly everyone one talks to in nearly any field says that many of the interesting challenges for their discipline are at the interfaces with other disciplines. I think this is in part a response to recognizing that important questions and challenges that face us today are so complex that they require the insights and methodologies of a variety of fields. But I think it's important to think carefully about what we mean by this word interdisciplinarity or interdisciplinary or whatever exactly way we say it, particularly when it comes to developing students to be interdisciplinary researchers and scholars. And one of the things I've learned is that this takes kind of a different form in different fields. So I just wanted to highlight that. A couple of years ago, I was at a conference of English and history faculty members and students, so it was a group of humanists, and they were talking about inculcating interdisciplinarity in themselves and in students. The conversation really focused on the role of language learning and how to fund travel to archives. The prevailing assumption was that one person really needed to become familiar with a variety of ideas or traditions or disciplines. And what really surprised me most about that conversation was that it was so different than what a parallel conversation in the sciences would have sounded like, where the assumption would have been, I think, to be interdisciplinary means knowing how to talk to people in a variety of fields in a way that's accessible to them, and how to listen and ask questions in order to harvest their ideas, and how to work together as in a team and bring people together from a variety of perspectives. And so I think this was 2 kind of different notions of interdisciplinarity. However, I think whether the goal is to develop students into polymaths or into collaborators on teams, students need to learn to talk with others, to learn from others, and to trade ideas. And so I want to offer some concrete ideas about how to do that. First, I think it's really important to reduce organizational barriers. I think it's really important that students are able to move freely and take advantage of the resources that are available all across the university. I sometimes say that our role in our job at the Vice Provost for Graduate Education at Stanford is we are here to put the uni in university. So can students take classes across all schools? In the 6 or 7 schools here that offer the doctorate, can students freely take classes in all of them or even in ones that do not offer the doctorate? Can students get a degree in another field or discipline along the way? Brown University just announced an initiative where they are going to provide additional funding for some doctoral students to do a master's degree in a related but somewhat different field in order to provide additional breadth. In the later years of students' doctoral programs, when usually they're just doing directed research and taking classes that are called directed research, is it okay for them to take classes, maybe not to provide breadth for that particular project, but to set them up for future broader inquiry by language learning or learning introductory something in an entirely other field? Are students able to be supported by and work in labs of faculty outside of their home department? That often poses lots of administrative challenges, but I think we ought to be able to solve those problems. That shouldn't be an obstacle to students. Are dissertation committees able to have a wide representation of faculty members from across the university? And indeed, could a student have a chair or a primary dissertation advisor who was from a different department or program? These are all organizational and administrative questions. We also want to think about ways to bring students together in conversation around ideas and intellectual topics that make those groups explicitly interdisciplinary. So we're very fortunate at Stanford that about half of our graduate students, so over 4,000 students, live on campus. So they are each other's roommates and neighbors. And so as part of our housing program and as part of our university-wide new graduate student orientation, we very deliberately, explicitly, and repeatedly say, this is a huge advantage because you have an opportunity not only to make friends across different disciplinary lines, so that keeps you from being lonely, and that's that's an important thing to do, is to make friends, but you will be meeting people from a whole variety of points of view and perspectives, and that will help broaden your educational experience. And so we really try and make this connection very explicitly. In addition, we try and offer programs which deliberately bring people together in interdisciplinary communities to have conversations. So one of my colleagues piloted a program called 12 at 12, where 12 students and a faculty member meet monthly at noon and talk about a set of questions and ideas and readings that they themselves identify. We've also tried to figure out lists of courses that someone calls outward-facing courses that are in one discipline but are welcoming of students from other fields. The first domain of development on my earlier slide was the development as a researcher and scholar, and so this is the second challenge that I wanted to explore. Let's take a sip of water here. Sure, I'll just leave that crocodile up there for a second. It's really surprising to me and to many of us how little systematic attention has been paid to understanding how to develop expertise and how to promote student learning at this high level that is the doctorate. As a result, I think most faculty members, and I would put myself in that camp, are really operating on instinct or replicating what they themselves were taught. And I think most of us have actually a set of implicit assumptions about how students learn or how to teach them. I think we rarely make those explicit. So what I want to do here is talk about what I think are several theories of doctoral preparation that are in wide use. So there's the osmosis theory, where students learn by reading good research and just being near faculty members who are doing high-quality research. And I think the assumption then is that students will absorb what they need to know. There's the sink or swim theory. So students are thrown into their initial teaching experience or initial research assignment and left to thrash their way to completion with little guidance. Those who succeed may, in fact, know something about swimming by virtue of their prior undergraduate program or a prior master's program or coming from an academic family. There's the talented students will self-discover theory, which says that doctoral programs should just get out of the way and that students will figure out their own self-development. They'll figure out what they need to know and they'll go get it, and we should just not impede that. I would observe that those without the internal resources, skills, or self-confidence to learn what they need might abandon the process along the way. There's the high pressure, and I can't say this phrase, the high pressure crucible theory, which is that graduate education is a set of high stakes tests and hurdles. So throughout the process, all of the stakes are really high. Students are expected to perform at a very high level. This is the kind of like the Marines, right? That which does not kill us will make us stronger. This makes them stronger, and those who are less capable are weeded out. There's a high support model, which says that everyone should succeed and we need to provide as much guidance and support along the way as possible. There's a very strong social justice element in this theory and this set of assumptions, and my observation is that this kind of presumption is often found in highly structured cohort-based programs, which are often located in professional schools. So I think that you may recognize yourself or your colleagues, or in fact your own training, in one of these theories. But you may have noticed that the word apprenticeship was not on this list. Most students will say, oh yes, I'm in some version of apprenticeship. And with students, the word apprenticeship, I think, has a really bad reputation. As a theory of doctoral education, it implies indentured servitude and the total dependence on one advisor who controls the student. It suggests conformity and may result in the inability to develop an independent voice or line of thought. At its worst, there may be neglect or exploitation of the student. But, as my slide here says, I think it's time to reappropriate the term apprenticeship and re-elevate it to, I think, its important place in doctoral education. The key move here, I think, is the shift from seeing students as apprenticed to a master to really recognizing that they are apprenticed with an experienced mentor. And I would want to say that apprenticeship pedagogy has a very long and honorable history in American doctoral education. G. Stanley Hall, who was the first president of Clark University, was a real noted doctoral educator, helped found the field of psychology in the United States. He was the first president of the American Psychological Association. He referred to what he did, I love this term, as elbow learning. And I think that's just a really great phrase to capture what I mean by apprenticeship pedagogy, which I think stands in pretty stark contrast to the Darwinian models that I had on the earlier slide. And as President Bach said, cognitive sciences are really showing us much about how students learn and develop, which is better in purposefully structured environments with guidance. So how does apprenticeship pedagogy work? And I think it really is a lot like craft apprenticeship. Students learn by observing expert practice and then trying it. Often this involves breaking the whole into constituent components. It includes creating occasions and assignments for students to practice key tasks repeatedly. So these might be simulations, defending a grant proposal to a mock panel review. It might be problems with known solutions. It's very common in mathematics to give students a problem they haven't seen, where the faculty members know what the answer is, and help them understand how to solve that. It might be well-designed smaller components of a larger work. So a course on scholarly publication. Very common in the biological sciences are research rotations with research rotation assignments, which are small, manageable chunks, which help the student learn before throwing them into the overwhelming thing of do your own research. In all of these cases, the students then engage in repetitive practice with feedback, which helps them improve. And this kind of coaching helps students develop their own feedback mechanisms and understand how it is that they learn and what it is they need to look for as they want to improve. All of this takes time, so students iterate towards independence and towards states of increased ambiguity. And in the end, of course, we have to help the students integrate all of these components into the whole that makes the complexity of professional practice in all of our fields. This expects a lot of faculty members and students, let me say. Faculty mentors need to be expert. They need to understand their expertise well enough to model the whole for others. They have to develop strategies for teaching the constituent components. They have to help students take those component parts and integrate them back into a whole. They have to know when to offer guidance and when to let students try and fail. They have to have an internal model of the typical student's development over time. They have to have experience with the kinds of scaffolding and coaching that will move students along this trajectory towards expertise and independence. And they have to customize learning experiences for each student because, of course, not all students are the same, which that then requires knowing the student reasonably well and having a theory of customization. For their part, students have to adapt to a new way of learning, which is not what they've been doing and succeeding at for all of their prior formal schooling. They have to practice, 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 because research is a craft, and as I think some research is coming out now, development of expertise takes around 10,000 hours of practice. They need to take active responsibility for their own learning. They have to reflect on what they've done and then develop models and patterns to help them in the future. They need to learn how to generalize to other contexts, and they have to take risks and be willing to fail. I so appreciate the question on failure earlier today. So how can we foster the kinds of relationships that will allow elbow learning to flourish? Well, that's the third challenge, advising. Whenever I talk with students about how to improve the educational experience, the top response is fix advising. Many students have good advising relationships, but when they talk about that, they usually start by saying, I'm really lucky. They usually say this sort of apologetically. It has this sort of survivor guilt to it. And I would submit that this should not be a matter of luck. I actually think this is a very serious matter. So let me highlight a few features of positive advising relationships and provide some ideas about how to promote them. First, I think that every student needs to have multiple mentoring relationships with several faculty members. Those 3 domains, as simple as they look when I put them up on a slide, are so big and encompass so much that is too much to expect one super mentor to do it all. I think that is a bad assumption. So we need to have multiple mentors for every student. I think this is especially true then with interdisciplinary students and interdisciplinary projects. So students should be encouraged to talk to many faculty members. And I think it's also important to help students learn how to build peer networks. They learn a lot from one another, from their near peers, those that are slightly more advanced. In fact, they learn a lot from those who are coming behind them. And so students really can and should mentor one another, and I think we need to encourage them deliberately to do so. These kinds of apprenticeship relationships are much more likely to flourish when they're based on the qualities of respect, trust, and reciprocity. Now, these qualities, of course, make any relationship much more pleasant. We like being in these kinds of relationships. But I think that they are also necessary conditions for learning, and I think this is the route to maintaining high standards. So it's not just about being nice. It's about having enough respect and trust that you can tell people things that they don't necessarily want to hear, provide the coaching that they need. Respect builds trust, and trust is essential for good communication and honest feedback. I think reciprocity in that relationship is also important, but I think it's important to recognize that an advisor-student kind of reciprocity is really different than in a peer relationship. So students get training, advice, sponsorship, funding, support, encouragement, and feedback, but faculty members get something too. They get new ideas, infusions of energy and excitement, the satisfaction of developing the next generation, and an intellectual legacy. Students often have no idea what it is that faculty members get out of this relationship, and for some students this makes them very hesitant to ask for help, and so I think it's important, again, to make these things somewhat more explicit. Respect, trust, and reciprocity require knowing yourself well and knowing the other person well in any kind of a human relationship. It requires clear communication, and a lot of times in clear communication it's really helpful to set expectations early on and revisit them occasionally, which helps avoid escalating misunderstandings. In front of you, we put a sheet called the Expectation Scales Worksheet. This is a tool that we adapted at Stanford and that we are sharing widely. And let me just take a moment to tell you what this is. So this is 16 items that are things that we think that faculty and graduate students should have some clear understanding and have explicit expectations about. They're set up as scales with 2 endpoints. This is not about right and wrong answers. There's not a secret quiz in here. A lot of times I think these scales are set up that way. Both endpoints of every one of these scales is a very reasonable, valid, and perfectly good way to do graduate education. But these are things that we think that people hold as assumptions in their head and thus don't make explicit and thus are sometimes a matter of misunderstandings. So what I'd like you to do, since I've probably hit that 20-minute mark where your mind is now drifting, as I learned today, is if you would take a look at this and complete for yourself what you think the right answer is for you, items 2, 6, 11, and 15, and kind of look up when you're done, because then I'll go to the next part. So what I'd like you to do now is to turn to the person next to you or behind you and talk about, first of all, why did you answer the way you did? And secondly, if a student had a really different opinion about this, what would you do? So I'm delighted that this has occasioned some conversation. So are there particular observations or anything that you talked about that would be good to share? Yes, sir. And I'll repeat what you say because of the microphonal issues. First of all, tell us who you are and what department you're in. Okay, this is John from the School of Public Health.
And all three of us are in the School of Public Health that we were preparing our answers to, and it seemed that one of the questions that the funding base of supporting the graduate student education really affected.
Great. So the observation here is that the funding base, I'm going to paraphrase because I'm going to keep us moving forward, is that the funding base really affects the kinds of answers. Great point. And the funding base not only varies within a particular department or school, which was John's observation of 3 faculty members from public health, but it also affects across the university. So again, not right and wrong, but really important to make explicit and talk about. Another observation. Okay, yes, you over here. Barbara from Cognitive Science. Great. Discovered enormous difference between the sciences and humanities. Big surprise. Okay, no, but really important to recognize. There is so much more variance, I think, on our campuses than among our fields across universities. And Barbara needs to say one more thing.
Just if I could be a little bit more specific on how much the advisor is involved in the student's graduate education, it appears to be much more intense in sciences than it is in humanities, which could account for or be related to the very lengthy trajectory.
Great. Fabulous observation. Okay, so so just again to repeat for the recording in the microphone here, that the faculty members in the sciences seem to be much more involved, and I would say on a day-to-day basis, than in the humanities, and that this perhaps, the hypothesis is related to the lengthy time to degree. I'll say we did a survey of faculty members in the Carnegie Initiative project, and one of the questions we asked was, how frequently do you meet with students in the last year? You know, it sort of went from every day to like once a semester, and there was a real distribution across fields that way. And now I'm going to take one more comment from the back. Use ma'am.
Public health, and my colleague here is from anthropology, so we actually sort of understood each other's disciplinary orientation to some extent.
Okay, so that was an anthropologist and a public health person talking.
And I'm a demographer by background, so that probably helps a little bit. But one of the observations we made was about your scale, and I have to tell you, I do measurements, so this is a great one that I can comment on. But we actually have the same philosophy, but we came up with slightly different scores.
Okay, so they have the same philosophy and different scores.
And I think the operative word for us that changed our scores was the word responsible.
Okay, great. So it was the word responsible, and you're going to amplify on that, I know. Or do you? Or not?
To the extent, so for example, when the networking question at meetings, the question there was, are you responsible for the network for the students, or can you facilitate it in such a way that they have those
Great.
networking opportunities, but you're not the responsible agent? And I think that's why we came up with
Great.
slightly different scores.
Good. So the observation then was on the networking item that while the word responsible, is it about making opportunities available or making sure that students avail themselves, I'm paraphrasing, of those opportunities? So how responsible are you? Another observation that people sometimes make when they look at this is on the same item for the same student at different stages in their graduate program, they would think about this in a different way. And so the point that I would like to make about all of this is we hope that this is a matter of explicit conversation, that this is about opening up the discussion around expectations, and that expectations need to be both visited and revisited. And that's why on the back of the sheet we have some suggestions about how to use this. I will say when we use this with students at Stanford, we say to them, do not fill this out, walk into your advisor's office, plop this on their desk, and say, how do you score? That would be not a good way to use this. But we do hope that really faculty members take the initiative, and we just see this really as a public domain document and invite you to take this, modify it for your own purposes, and so forth. I'm going to move forward here. 2 more comments on 21st century advising. It's also important for us to share, learn, and improve. Being a good mentor is not an innate talent, nor solely a function of chemistry. Very few of us have had the chance to learn how to give and set clear expectations, how to give feedback, or how to have hard conversations. In our survey of doctoral faculty members in the Carnegie Project, we asked, is there someone who's advising you try to emulate? Now, not surprisingly, the top answer, 38%, was their own advisor. But the most striking finding was that the second most common response, fully 33% of the respondents said, nobody. We did not ask them how many of them had an anti-role model. Several, however, volunteered that fact. The point here is that communication techniques can be learned. Folks in human resources have a lot of experience with this. So I think it's important not only to create occasions to learn the techniques and skills of how to have hard conversations or set expectations and give clear feedback, but then to create occasions for faculty members to learn about and discuss each other's advising philosophies and strategies, both within departments and across them. I also think the opportunity to discuss challenging moments and how to overcome challenging moments is really important. I think this is vital for junior faculty. This is a way to improve the next generation. Finally, I would say, more than just encouraging multiple advising relationships, we bear a collective responsibility for student success. We need to remember that students are admitted to departments, programs, and universities, not just to work with individual faculty members. So I encourage you to think about all of these apprenticeship and advising matters, not just for your advisees, but for all students in your department. And I think that, for me, is the transition to moving from talking about individuals to talking more about departments and programs. So the fourth challenge I want to talk about is how to create a positive culture and climate in departments. Now, I suspect that most of you have been in a department where you say to yourself, now that is an exciting intellectual community. That place, if you will, has it all going on. I just want you to think about that for a moment. Maybe this is a place where you studied. Maybe this is the department where you currently teach. I hope that's true. Maybe it's just a department you visited and gave a talk. But what were some of the things about what you saw in that department that made you say that? I believe that departments are more than just convenient collections of faculty members for bureaucratic purposes. I think good departments are healthy, vibrant intellectual communities. And in fact, I think most faculty members want to be in those. I have yet to meet a faculty member who says, oh no, I do not want to be in a department that is an exciting intellectual community. Get me away from that. I think there are certain qualities of communities that do make them more vibrant and stimulating and more embracing of that vision of apprenticeship and advising I talked about earlier. They're knowledge-centered. Knowledge creation and sharing is at their heart. They're diverse and broadly and multi-generational. They are welcoming of different points of view. Moreover, they welcome and encourage people with different experiences and backgrounds. And they are explicitly multi-generational. That means involving senior faculty members, junior faculty members, postdocs, senior graduate students, junior graduate students, and in some cases even undergraduates. This obligates senior members to active participation in the intellectual life of the department. It raises the question of how are new and junior members brought in. Departments that are good intellectual communities are risk-taking. They are flexible and forgiving. It's places where it's okay to make mistakes, to learn from failure. I once interviewed a faculty member who said he challenged his advisees to make a mistake every day. He would say to them, if you do not break something, make a mistake, or have a failure, you're not trying hard enough. That was, for me, really inverted how to think about this. Because I think most of us are really risk-averse. So I want to try an activity with you to help us become a little bit more risk-embracing and embracing of failure. It's very simple. So this is what we're going to do. When I give you the signal, the people on this side of the room are going to say very, very loudly, I just made a terrible mistake. All right? The people on this side of the room are going to cheer as if you just won the Nobel Prize in MacArthur or won the National Sports Championship. Okay, ready? 1, 2, 3. I just made a terrible mistake. Okay, it's corny, but it feels good, doesn't it? So I would encourage us to think about how can we make our communities, our departments, and our lives places where we can go, woohoo, I just made a terrible mistake, because that means I took a risk, I tried something new, I kind of put myself out there. And to trust that one's colleagues are going to respond by going, woo, as opposed to, oh my God, you're such a jerk, right? So I just wanted to kind of offer that. These intellectual communities are respectful and generous, so they support interaction rather than isolation. People are generous with, again, their most precious resource, time, their ideas, their feedback. Success and achievement are not a zero-sum game. Your success does not come at my expense. Instead, your success is a measure, in part, of my investment in you. And I think that's a really important way for departments to be. All of this isn't totally easy, so such communities are deliberately tended. It takes time and effort to make a community be like this and stay like this. So you have to think about how to bring new students in. Maybe that's a big sibling program where more established graduate students pair up with new graduate students at the time of admission and one-on-one mentor them through the first year of graduate school. And engaging students fully in the life of the department, including them on curriculum committees, hiring committees, admissions committees, really bringing them into the life of the department. Moving beyond lecture to intellectual exchange. So one of the departments I remember talking to in the Carnegie Project, they started a seminar program, and the rule in that seminar was for every visitor, the first 3 questions had to come from students. Ooh, that sort of kind of changed the stakes. Allowing risk and failure. So a seminar series in which speakers talk about projects that didn't work and how they learned from that. Or a crazy ideas seminar where it's like, well, this thing couldn't possibly work. It's completely nuts and whatever, but that's a way to give feedback. But again, it's a way to spark people's imagination. And of course, social events are important too. That's how we get to know each other. That builds that kind of respect and trust. So don't underestimate the power of social events and social lubricants. At Stanford, we're putting this notion of intellectual community into practice also with a program we call SPICE. We have a lot of acronyms. So Student Projects for Intellectual Community Enhancement. We offer seed grants to groups of students who want to do a set of activities in their department to increase the intellectual community, or in interdisciplinary ways for communities of interest, I would call them. So we have a group that we funded every year called SKIT, that's from the classics department. They take a classic Greek play, including the Acharnians last year. They do an absolutely fresh translation with all modern jokes about Sarah Palin and whatever in there. They do seminars on how you do translation, and then they actually put on a show, and they produce this play with graduate students and undergraduates from the classics department as the actors, and this is now put on campus-wide every year. We funded another group called SUPER, Stanford University Photonics Research. This is a group of optics researchers from across the university, a whole variety of departments, as you can imagine. They put on a slam-bang conference every year off campus, bring in national speakers, faculty, students. They all sit together for 3 days and just talk photonics, and it's just, they love it. I can talk more about that program if you want. But let me move on here. I talked about diverse and multi-generational as among the characteristics of a vibrant intellectual community, which takes us to this 5th challenge: how can we get as diverse a graduate student population as possible? And when I say diversity, I really mean diversity broadly defined, diverse life experiences, diverse backgrounds. And I think this has been really hard for us in graduate education. This is a shared challenge. I think there's been a lot of hand-wringing about this for, half a century. I think we all know our undergraduate student populations are a good deal more diverse than our graduate student populations. So I've been thinking about this a lot lately, and I want to sort of say that currently my thinking is that the problem of diversity takes different forms for different students. I just want to share that with you. So for African American, Hispanic, Native American, Asian Pacific Islanders, what we call underrepresented minority students, I think the problem that needs to be solved is really one of underrepresentation and the legacy of discrimination and historical inequities. For women these days, particularly in science engineering, what I hear is it may be less about underrepresentation than about how to be a scientist and how to have a fulfilling personal and professional life. I won't use the word balanced, but I'll say fulfilling, given that domestic responsibilities still often fall disproportionately on women. For students with physical disabilities, deaf, blind, physically impaired students, I think the challenges are quite different. It's figuring out literally how to do the work, how to get appropriate accommodation, and how to be fully integrated into the intellectual life of the lab or the department. And then I think there are students with what I sort of think of as invisible disabilities, sexual orientation, depression, learning disabilities. I think they're really challenged to try and figure out when and when not to disclose, and to whom, and how that might be received. Because I think there are still people who believe that students with those kinds of diversities may not belong in the academic life or at this level of academia. And for some of them, their very presence is political. I heard that phrase from a transgendered student. That was a very important note. I think for all students, though, one of the questions that always has to be asked is this identity relevant to academic pursuits? And if so, to what extent? And I think that's a really complicated question. For many, the answer is yes, because they see different questions or see problems from different angles or have access to different kinds of knowledge because of their prior experiences and how that's linked to their identity. I was really happy to hear that Johns Hopkins is the home of fellowships, graduate fellowships, because that gives me an opportunity to also talk about a program that we've been doing at Stanford for the last 3 years and we'll be continuing for the next, I think, 5, that we hope will be shared by other colleagues around the country. So we call this we're really into acronyms, DARE, Diversifying Academia, Recruiting Excellence, Doctoral Fellowship Program. This program is a competitive internal fellowship program for advanced doctoral students. It provides 2 years of funding, so tuition and stipend. It runs across the university, all 7 of our schools. It's for students whose presence will diversify the professoriate, and they need to make the affirmative case in their application as to how their presence will diversify the professoriate and how they're already using diversity to advance the education of others. We offer them 2 years of funding, but we also offer them a curriculum. And in the first year of this fellowship, so sort of their penultimate year in graduate school, we do a year-long set of courses. So in the fall, I teach a course on faculty roles and responsibilities. In the winter, we do site visits to campuses around the region, day-long site visits to a community college, a regional comprehensive teaching university, a liberal arts college, and a public research university. And in the spring, we do a quarter-long course on the academic job search, and we kind of break it down, soup to nuts, the CV, cover letter, interviewing, negotiating, teaching statement, all of the pieces of that. We try and really get them jump-started on that. This has, I think, really helped these students demystify and understand a lot of the implicit assumptions and get some skills, knowledge, as well as a network of colleagues. I've learned a couple things that have surprised me a little bit from working with this program, and I wanted to share that with you. One is that a prestigious, high-profile program like this on campus has symbolic importance for these students as a way of exemplifying the institution's commitment to diversity. So it takes it from the talk to the walk, and that's been hugely important in combating the perception that academia and the academic life may not really be for someone like me. Students really wrestle with being a change agent and how to do that. When and how to be public about being an advocate or an ally, when and how to authentically act out their commitments to diversity, when to hold back, because they all get that they want to be in academia for the long haul, and so you need to not be so much of a thorn that you're rejected. And that's a really tough balancing act for people, and that's a really great set of questions. And one of the most positive and unanticipated consequences is there's a real broad network that develops among our fellows. They get a much broadened sense of the diversity of diversities and the similarities and differences of the challenges that they face. I think they have a real increased commitment to other students and being an ally for other students and colleagues in their future lives. Okay, so to summarize here, I've talked about 5 challenges to doctoral student development: promoting interdisciplinary thinking, understanding how students learn, improving advising relationships, building intellectual communities, and fostering diversity. All of this, just to recap, in the interest of promoting doctoral student development in these 3 domains. So implicit in all of this, I think, is the encouragement to rethink your current practices of doctoral education. As President Daniels said earlier this morning, not just business as usual. I hope that I and others today will spark your imagination and get you thinking and motivated to try some different things. And I would say they do not have to be really big things. There's a lot of power in small changes day to day. Think of them as little pilot projects and experiments, like lower the stakes about trying new things. I just want to say a little bit about what are sources of inspiration for things you can do differently. First of all, I hope that you see each other as primary sources of inspiration and new ideas. I think there's great value in trading the how do you do it in your department kinds of questions. Because just like that expectation scales sheet hopefully makes clear, it's not obvious or should not be assumed how we do anything in doctoral education. There's enormous variation around the campus. So ask each other. Then you can also trade ideas with colleagues at other universities, either in your field or in related fields. And I assure you, as President Bach said, there is not an idea shortage. You just have to look at the range and variation around the qualifying exam to recognize that. So you can ask about program elements like courses. How many courses do they take? How are they structured? For how many years? How are qualifying exams structured? The end exams? What are dissertation committees like, or expectations around that, or advising? Or you can step back if program elements gets to be too hard and gets us stuck on things like resources, and ask some bigger questions. How do you foster creative thinking? How do you keep students' passion alive? How do you teach the ability to ask a good research question? How do students develop critical judgment? How much is enough, and when is it time for students to leave, and how do you know? These are challenges that cross every single discipline, I assure you, and there are not easy and obvious answers, but I think they're really interesting and fruitful questions. And the final thing I want to say, big lesson out of the Carnegie Project, students are the secret agent of change. I don't underestimate them, harness their power. Make them your allies. They are smart and thoughtful about their own experience and its educational purpose. They want it to be as good as it can be. They want this for themselves, and they want this for the students coming after them. They have a tremendous amount of energy and time to bear on these kinds of questions, and they're willing to do this in the service of making change. And being involved with improving the doctoral program is in itself a really important part of the socialization process in helping them become those who will become faculty members or work with academia or advocate on behalf of academia for their own development. I just want to conclude by reminding you that this is all terribly consequential. I think this matters a lot. Helping our smart and passionate graduate students reach their full potential is important for our planet and our future. Every time I'm in front of students, which isn't actually all that often, I always end anything I do with them by thanking them and telling them what a privilege it is for me to come to work every day because I get to make them thrive. That's my mission in life, is to help them thrive and have a better graduate student experience. I tell them how incredibly smart and talented they are, how amazing they are. And they look on their face is like, really? And it's like, really? It's really true. And I think people don't tell them this often enough. So I encourage you to tell your students how great they are. All they do is compare themselves to you. It's a very high mountain to climb. So help them remember that you're here to help them be great, and they're there to help you be great. So that's what I wanted to say. Thank you very much. I guess we have about 10 minutes till lunch, 5-10 minutes till lunch. All right. Or everyone just wants to go eat. Is there one over there? Great. Hi, could you start by telling us who you are, because maybe your colleagues don't all know you.
Yeah, certainly. My name is Chris Neal, and I'm the DGS in the English department here.
I'm sorry.
My name's Chris. I'm in English.
Thank you.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you for your presentation. All I really wanted to mention was just a factual matter, something we chuckled over a few minutes ago about the supposedly large difference between time to degree in the humanities and the sciences. A 2006 National Science Foundation study gave these numbers for time to degree in engineering, the life sciences, and physical sciences. Physical sciences was 7.9 years. The life sciences were 8.3, and engineering was 8.6. The most recent MLA study, Modern Language Association, for time to degree showed an average of 8.2 years, so I think we're well within the range. And I would just say that there's also a 2009 National Science Foundation study that shows that far and away the longest time to degree, 12.7 years, is for education PhDs.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And I think there's a couple things to note when thinking about time to degree data. This is the devil is in the details. One of the questions is exactly what you're measuring, whether it's enrolled time to degree or from start to the finish. And in education, many of those students are going to school part-time. So that complexifies the comparison. I am not saying that education has it all right, trust me, but I do think that complexifies that. I think another way to think about these, I think is an even better way to think about this, was pioneered by a colleague at Berkeley, Marisi Nayrad, and that's thinking about time to career. And that's thinking about not only the time to PhD, but the time of postdoc, and thinking about that as an entire educational combination. And when you look at that, there's virtually no difference among fields. So I think your point is well taken, but I'll just even amplify that. Other observations, comments? Yeah, okay, up here. Hang on, we're going to bring you a microphone.
Hi, my name is Ben Vinson from the History Department at the Homewood campus, also the Vice Dean for Graduate Education. I had a question. Some of the elements of your 5 challenges, including advising, diversity, teaching, some of this actually involves tinkering around with the culture of an institution. And so I just wanted to kind of pick your brain a little bit on how do we achieve some of the goals that you've outlined in ways that are also sensitive to the particular nuances and the substance and the texture of the institutions in which we work.
Yes. So culture change is hard and culture change is slow. I know there's anthropologists here, so they can amplify on this far better than I can. But I think thinking about this as an active culture change is exactly the right way to think about that. So who changes a culture? Those within the culture. So it's not about a vice provost coming in and saying, thou shalt. It's really about deciding what we will do and how we think about that. But I do think that making some of the assumptions about how we operate explicit helps us to see whether, in fact, the culture that we currently have is the one that we want, or if we are in, if the values that we think we're espousing are really the ones that we are enacting in our behavior. So I think even just talking about it out loud is a way of making sure that those values are in alignment. If we value research over teaching, then we need to say that we value research over teaching, and then we can behave as if we value research over teaching. But if we think that the balance is off, that talking about that helps to make that a little bit more clear. And it's the behavior, right? I mean, culture is always enacted in the behavior. So I think you've put your finger right on it. I would say yes.
I was curious whether you'd have a comment about the size of units in which this type of vibrant intellectual community can work. Partly because it struck me that a lot of these elements, I'm very grateful to mentors in a center that was bridging the School of Medicine and School of Public Health that integrated a lot of these. And it's actually interesting that it works at a certain scale and then it evolves when it gets to a different scale, and it's interesting as to how that works.
So you're sort of asking there, is it too big question? There could also be an is it too small question. But is there a right size of a community? That's probably true, and people who study communities probably have a better sense of that. But I think most students and most faculty actually operate within a number of different communities, intersecting, overlapping, interlocking, right? So a lab is a community and ought to be a vibrant, healthy, thriving intellectual communities where people come and go. But that's embedded within maybe a sub-department or a field. You know, chemistry, the analytic chemists are probably different than the physical chemists. So much I know about chemistry, which is different than the chemistry department. But for some students, they're maybe involved with the Chinese Graduate Student Association, and that's a different kind of a community. So I think it's important to recognize that we all operate in multiple communities. Centers are really important communities. I think you're right. Yes. I don't think you can... You could probably be in too many because then you can't really actively participate in all of them, but I think it certainly could be more than one. I sense a desire for lunch.